March 28, 1942. Low tide on the River Loire, a cold gray light over the docks of Saint-Nazaire, on the occupied Atlantic coast of France. There is a ship in the gate of the great dry dock that should not be there. It is a destroyer, or it was one. The bow is crushed and folded back on itself, driven hard up onto the caisson of the largest dry dock in the world. The stern sits low and broken in the water. Two of its funnels have been cut away, and the two that remain are raked at a strange angle, as if someone had tried to make a British ship look like a German one, and very nearly succeeded. There is oil on the water, cordite in the air. German officers are climbing aboard. The ship is a trophy. The port is theirs again. The British raid has failed. The wooden motor launches are wrecked or sunk. Most of the raiders are dead or captured. The dock gate is dented but holding, and the destroyer that was meant to break it is sitting on top of it, going nowhere. By mid-morning, 40 or so men are walking the buckled deck. Engineers, dockyard staff, officers posing for photographs beside the captured wreck. Whatever the British were trying to do, they have clearly failed. Not one of them understands what they are standing on. This is a story about a question that haunts the whole of it. How do you hide 4 tons of high explosive in plain sight, in the most heavily defended harbor on the Atlantic coast, and persuade the men standing directly on top of it that there is nothing left to fear? They were standing on it, and they could not see it. Begin with the dock, because the dock is the whole story. A fast capital ship loose in the Atlantic was Britain's nightmare in 1942. The country lived and died by its convoys, the slow columns of merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and weapons across the ocean. A single German battleship among those convoys could do catastrophic damage and tie down enormous British forces hunting it. In May 1941, the battleship Bismarck had proved exactly that, sinking the pride of the Royal Navy before the entire British fleet fell on her and sent her down. Bismarck had a sister. Her name was Tirpitz. She was newer. She was as powerful. And she was the ship Britain feared most in the world. The question the whole Atlantic campaign turned on in early 1942 was simple and terrifying. Would Tirpitz come out the way Bismarck had? And the answer to that question hinged on a single facility. A warship of that size, 50,000 tons at full load, needed a dry dock big enough to take her if she was damaged in action. Without such a dock on the Atlantic coast, a sortie was a one-way gamble. Damage her, and she couldn't be fixed forward of German home waters. She'd have to limp all the way back around to Norway or Germany, exposed and vulnerable the whole way. There was exactly one dry dock on the entire Atlantic coast large enough for Tirpitz. It was at Saint-Nazaire, so the German logic was complete, and it was rational. The dock was a strategic asset of the First Order. The harbor was fortified to the teeth coastal batteries, anti-aircraft guns, a submarine base with concrete pens that no bomb of the period could touch, harbor defense vessels, guard ships in the estuary. The only realistic threat to the dock was from the air, and that threat had been contained. The idea that the British might come by sea, might sail up the Loire estuary in the dark, past the batteries, past the guard ships, across sandbanks the Germans believed no warship could cross, was so unlikely that professional assessments dismissed it almost as an absurdity. The harbor was impenetrable. The dock was safe. Their reasoning was sound. Their reasoning was entirely correct inside its own frame. The frame was the problem. The British had understood something precise, that the whole Atlantic question hung on one dock, and that the cheapest way to destroy a dock you cannot bomb from the air is to drive a bomb into it on a ship you are prepared to lose. The ship they chose was HMS Campbeltown, one of 50 elderly American destroyers handed to Britain in 1940, when Britain was desperate for anything that could float and fight. She was more than 20 years old. She was tired. She was, in the clinical language of the plan, entirely expendable. Nobody was going to miss her. What the dockyard at Devonport did to her in roughly 10 days was quiet and deliberate and deadly. 2 of her 4 funnels came off entirely. The remaining 2 were cut down and raked backward at an angle, so that from a distance in the dark, she might pass for a German torpedo boat long enough to matter. Her heavy guns and torpedoes were removed to lighten her. She had to ride high enough in the water to clear the river sandbanks. Armor plate was bolted along her sides and around her bridge to give some protection to the men who would be standing exposed on her open deck under fire. And low in her bow, behind a steel support pillar, hidden deep inside the hull, a Royal Navy explosives expert named Lieutenant Nigel Tibbets built the weapon. 24 depth charges packed together into a sealed steel tank and encased in concrete. Roughly 4 tons of high explosive. Tibbets insisted on the concrete for 2 reasons. It hid the charge from any search, and it focused the blast so that when it detonated, the force would drive into the dock gate rather than dissipate upward into open air. The firing mechanism was acid delay fuses, pencil-thin tubes in which acid slowly ate through a fine wire. When the wire failed, the charge fired. They were never precise. You set them for a number of hours and accepted a margin of error in either direction. The plan called for detonation in the small hours of the morning, several hours after the ram, by which time the raiders would be gone and the harbor quiet. The fuses, as it turned out, would run slow. That miscalculation was about to become the most devastating accident of the entire operation. Around 600 men crossed the Bay of Biscay in the early hours of March 28th, Royal Navy sailors manning Campbeltown and a flotilla of small wooden motor launches, and Commandos, who would land and destroy the dock machinery while the ship did its work. The naval force was led by Commander Robert Ryder. The Commandos were led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman. Before they left, Lord Louis Mountbatten had told Newman something that deserves to sit in the silence for a moment. He told him that this operation was so hazardous, he did not expect any of them to get out again. That the loss of the entire force would be, in the cold arithmetic of the war, about equal to the loss of a single merchant ship, but that their success would save a great many merchant ships. And then he sent them. Think about being told that, and going anyway. As the flotilla came up the Loire, the German defenses began to wake. Searchlights swept the water and found them. A signal lamp challenged the incoming ships, and for a few extraordinary minutes, the bluff held a British signalman using a captured German call sign flashed back that they had been fired on by friendly forces and requested permission to proceed. The Germans hesitated. The guns paused. The ships crept closer in a silence that should have been impossible. Then it broke. Every gun on the river opened fire at once. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, commanding Campbeltown, ordered the German flag hauled down and the white ensign raised in its place. And he drove the old destroyer straight at the dock gate at nearly 20 knots, through a storm of fire, with the searchlights full in his eyes. At 1:34 in the morning, Campbeltown struck the caisson of the great dry dock and rode 33 feet onto it, exactly where she was meant to be. Beatty looked at his watch and noted they were 4 minutes late. It costs you nothing. While Campbeltown sat in the gate with 4 tons of hidden explosives slowly counting down, the men who had landed were fighting and dying in the dockyard around it. Demolition parties poured off the ship and across the dock to wreck the pumping machinery and the mechanisms that worked the gates. Lieutenant Stuart Chant, though already wounded, led his team 40 feet underground into the great pumping station, set their charges among machinery that could not easily be replaced, brought down the structure, and climbed back up into the fire. What remained of the Commandos fought their way through a town they could not escape, buying time for others, knowing the boats might already be gone. On the river, the wooden motor launches that were meant to carry the men home were caught in the open and destroyed one by one, too fragile for the guns they were running into. One of them carried Sergeant Thomas Durant of the Royal Engineers. Durant was at the boat's machine gun when the launch was caught by the German torpedo boat Jaguar, far larger, far more heavily armed, and calling on the launch to surrender. Durant answered with his gun. The 2 vessels fought at point-blank range, 50 to 60 yards apart, sometimes closing even further. He was hit again and stayed at his weapon. He kept firing on a wooden boat against a warship and refused every chance to stop. He fired until he physically could not continue, and the launch was boarded. He did not survive his wounds. Here is the detail that belongs in every history of this war. The German commanding officer of the Jaguar, Kapitän Leutnant Friedrich Karl Paul, was so struck by what he had witnessed that he later sought out Colonel Newman in the prisoner of war camp and personally suggested that this British sergeant be recommended for a high decoration. Sergeant Thomas Durant was awarded the Victoria Cross. It is one of very few ever granted on the strength of an enemy's account. It may be the only one awarded to a soldier for an action fought at sea. The man who had been trying to kill him asked that he be honored. The men the Germans had supposedly defeated had fought in a way that compelled their opponents to do that. By mid-morning, the Germans were certain the raid had failed. The flotilla was wrecked. Most of the Commandos were dead or captured. The dock gate was dented but holding. The old destroyer was sitting on top of it, spent and broken. Senior officers came down to inspect the wreck. Engineers, dockyard staff, men off duty, drawn by curiosity to see what the British had thrown at them and lost. Perhaps 40 men at the height of it, walking the buckled deck. If you had stood on that ship at 10 in the morning and searched it carefully, you would have found nothing to alarm you. No visible wiring, no obvious timer, no charge you could point to. Just a wrecked destroyer with an unexplained mass of concrete deep in the bow. British improvisation, someone noted. One more odd detail in a night full of them. The danger was not hidden from their eyes, it was hidden from their imagination. They were looking for what they believed a weapon looked like. They did not find that, because the British had built a weapon that did not look like one. A weapon with no wires you could cut, no timer you could see, no obvious furniture of a bomb at all. The weapon was the ship. And no professional, however careful, searches a captured destroyer on the assumption that the destroyer is the bomb, because nothing in his training has ever told him to. At approximately noon, the acid ate through the last wire. 4 tons of explosive that had been patiently sitting in the gate since 1:34 in the morning detonated. The force tore the caisson apart, and the sea poured in. The ship that had sat there all morning as a harmless trophy destroyed the very thing it had been driven into. In a single moment, exactly as designed, only hours later than planned, and precisely when the deck was most crowded. The fuses had run slow. The planners had never intended this. The delay, which had seemed like a failure of precision, had become the most effective part of the operation. More than 250 Germans died in that instant. Some accounts, counting the days that followed, put the total higher. The raid cost almost everything. Of roughly 612 men, 169 were killed. 215 were taken prisoner. Only 228 came home, and a handful of those only by walking through occupied France and across Spain to freedom. 5 Victoria Crosses were awarded for that single night, one of the highest concentrations for any action of the war. Commander Robert Ryder, who took the small ships in. Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty, who drove the old destroyer into the gate 4 minutes late. Able Seaman William Savage, who fought his gun on an open boat until he was killed at it. On his 6th wedding anniversary. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, who told his men they might have to walk home, and then led them in trying. And Sergeant Thomas Durant, whose enemy asked that he be honored. 2 of those 5 did not live to receive their medal. Now, the honest account has to add the complication, because this channel doesn't deal in legends. It is not certain that Tirpitz would have made an Atlantic sortie, even if the dock had survived. The German command had become deeply cautious with its remaining capital ships after losing Bismarck, and there were other reasons she might have stayed in the Norwegian fjords regardless. We cannot claim this single raid alone kept her out of the Atlantic. What we can say is narrower and still remarkable. The British identified the one piece of infrastructure that made the nightmare possible and removed it permanently in a single strike. The great dry dock at Saint-Nazaire did not work again for years. It was not repaired until the late 1940s. It was not formally returned to service until 1950. For the entire remainder of the war, it was a flooded ruin. Tirpitz never came out the way Bismarck had. She stayed in the fjords until the Royal Air Force finally destroyed her there in November 1944. There is one more thing I should tell you, and I will tell it plainly, because honesty is the only currency this kind of history can spend. The German engineer at the opening of this story, the man who climbs aboard the wreck and notes the unexplained concrete in the bow and files it away, he has no name in the historical record. There is no documented account of a single officer doing exactly that. He is a composite of the real party of German engineers and officers who genuinely were aboard that ship that morning, genuinely did examine it, and genuinely did not grasp what they were standing on. I gave one of them a form so you could stand on the deck beside him. The deck was real. The men on it were real. The unexplained concrete was real. What they failed to understand was real. The Germans had the most heavily defended harbor on the Atlantic coast of Europe. The British had a willingness to spend a ship to close a single gate. The German metric of success was control of the port, and by that measure, they won the night. The British metric of success was the dock out of action, and by that measure, the British had already won before the firing stopped. The weapon had no wires you could cut. The weapon had no timer you could find. The weapon did not look like a weapon, because the weapon was the ship. And 40 men stood on the deck in the morning sun and felt safe. At noon, they discovered what they'd been standing on. Subscribe to WW2 Forgotten Frontlines. We tell the stories where the numbers are small and the stakes are enormous. 4 tons of explosive against one dock against the whole Atlantic. The names you haven't heard yet deserve to be said.